very first speaker series in Sustainable Putnam around home composting with Jen Lerner. And just a real quick commercial for Sustainable Putnam. We're a community environmental activist group that we started about 5 months ago when Joe Montori had this mission and realized that he couldn't do it alone. And so he bribed a bunch of us to join him. And so we've got a pretty strong coalition of folks who are always looking for more to join us in supporting our mission. And our mission is to develop sustainable communities, ecologically sound, socially equitable, and economically responsible today and for future generations. And we meet every second Sunday of the month from 4 to 5:30 on this exact Zoom link. And we have a hike coming up on the 15th of this month at School Mountain Road in Fonstock at 1 p.m. So we'll figure out a way to do so in a way that's physically distant yet connected. We have a website, sustainableputnam.org, if you'd like to learn more about who we are and all of that. Or you can just reach out to us or ask some questions at the end of this session. And without further ado, I want to introduce Jen Lerner, amazing senior resource educator at Cornell Cooperative Extension. And she has legendary status in the composting world, and I'm sure you'll know why by the end of this conversation. And our request is that you mute your mics during the presentation, and then I think at the end of each section, Jen will be asking for questions, so you don't need to wait till the very end to ask questions, but we'll be able to do so fairly proximate to the material that we'll be working on. And without further ado, I'm proud to present Jen Lerner to the rest of y'all. Take it away.
Thanks. Hi. So welcome to a nice rainy fall day. I would love to talk to you about composting today. It's something near and dear to my heart. And hopefully we'll spend a little bit of time today talking about leaf management as well, since it really ties in beautifully to composting and managing organic wastes on your property. So let's dive in, and I'll tell you what we're going to look at today. But before we get started with the actual composting, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about Cornell Cooperative Extension. In Putnam County, we have a few divisions. One you may be familiar with is the 4-H program, which is a youth development program. But you may have also heard of Master Gardener Volunteers from Cornell Cooperative Extension as well. And those serve with us in the Environmental Horticulture and Natural Resources program, which currently is focusing on climate change issues and food systems issues in Putnam County. And there's some contact information there for you as well. But that climate change issue encompasses a lot of issues as well, and composting is definitely one of them. And it's one of the most important parts of our personal response to a changing climate and trying to mitigate some of those effects. So I just want to start though by asking you to try to find the chat window if you have never done this before, and answer this question. How many of you here compost? And if you don't compost, what are some of your concerns or barriers? Because a lot of the reason people don't compost is because they've tried it once and they've had some issues. So I'd love to hear what those issues are so we could tailor this class to help address some of those as we go. So if you don't know where the chat window is, depending on which kind of device you've got, it might be down at the bottom if you hover your mouse at the bottom. It can also be up at the top. And sometimes if your screen is completely covering the whole screen on your computer, you might have it where there are 3 little dots near the top. So some folks have composted. Some people compost sort of. I've been there for sure. Some folks are long-term composters. Some are beginning altogether. And I like to say I compost, and I do compost. And Yeah. So questions about like, can bread go into kitchen compostables? We'll talk about, yeah, from bread to cake, which one of those things can go into composting bins or compostable? All right. Okay. No, anybody have any problems with their composters? Okay, how to keep rodents out. So rodents is one of the issues that people have a lot of questions. Rodents, raccoons, and unfortunately in Putnam County, sometimes bears. Okay. Um, Too wet, that's another common issue. And sometimes if it gets too wet, it gets too stinky. Yeah, I'm just going to go on to the next slide because you are answering these questions as we go. Yep, how to keep it warm over the winter. What happens when it sort of cools out over the fall months and starts to get cold? And the difference between freestanding versus a roller bin, which gets that kind of wet, clumpy, sometimes stinky smell. So when we ask people, when we have asked over the years, what keeps them from composting, and so a lot of times it smells and what the compost bin might attract. Varmints, rodents. I had rats in my compost bin once. It was very entertaining. I also have had a very determined raccoons come as well. It can be an inconvenience. Some people don't want to be taking their compost from the house, walking outside in the middle of winter to dump it in a bin. Bins can be very expensive. They can be ugly. Um, um, and other reasons as well. There's a lot of different reasons to this whole process. Okay. So how do we get more people to compost and why should we? So I did want to spend a little bit of time looking at the reasons, since this is a group that focuses on sustainability, some of the reasons that we really want people to compost. We'll talk about why. We'll go through kind of the basics of composting. And if you can only stay for a short amount of time during this program, stick through to the composting basics, because then after that, we'll take a deeper dive. We'll look at compost uses and then a little bit about troubleshooting. And then near the end, we'll spend some time going through the different types of composting systems that you have out there, because there are a lot of different kinds, both large scale and small scale. For the most part, we'll talk about small scale composting today, because that's basically what we're going to be able to do in our backyards. So why compost? I gotta love that quote, because a rind is a terrible thing to waste. But it's more than just that. You'll find a lot more information at the Cornell Waste Management Institute's website, and I can share those either in the chat window later or via email if that's best for you all. But here's really why we all want to compost. If you look at, and these are old numbers, but if you look at the total municipal solid waste, or MSW, by material, the numbers from 2013 are showing materials that are highly recyclable or compostable in this mix. So 251 million tons before recycling. And all of those, look at all the ones that are circled in red, those are all recyclable. Compostable. Some are recycled. So this was before recycling. Some of these were indeed recycled. Things like metals and glass are fairly recyclable. But many of these materials are compostable. And we don't necessarily always think about things like rubber and textiles, leather as being compostable, but they do compost. Yard trimmings and food waste, certainly, and paper, when not recyclable, is also compostable. And the important part of this is that if they're ending up as municipal solid waste, they're going into landfills. And when we take materials that are compostable and put them into landfills, they produce methane gas, which is more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So looking at that kind of spread, you understand why we're really focused on doing something about getting more of that material into the compost bin or into commercial composting. And some cities in the United States do commercial composting, and they'll take anything that rots. And that's a good way to look at it. It's what will rot, right? So Over 70% of US waste is comprised of organic materials that can and should be composted. So looking at just adding up those numbers from the last slide, that's a lot of waste that can get encapsulated into landfills and turn into or exude methane gas. So if 65 tons are recycled and 22 tons are composted, these were recovered, that equals 168 million metric tons of CO2 that would otherwise go out into the atmosphere. But ideally, on our small scale composting, we're keeping the carbon that we are creating, the waste that we are using or creating, and using it in our compost bins. And really, that's just about anything that you can get in there. We'll talk about what you can put in there and what you can't. Okay, as we go on. So the ultimate benefit of this, of course, is that we'll have cleaner land, air, and water, and overall better health and a more sustainable economy. And I'll kind of break that down a little bit, but as we go through this, presentation. So why get everyone to compost? Well, we just talked about lowering the municipal solid waste volumes, but the idea of keeping carbon right where it's created, when leaves are falling off of your trees, it's kind of counterintuitive to put them in paper bags, put them on the side of the road and pay for someone to haul them away. They're getting hauled away. They're getting composted someplace else, but that's adding another layer of to the compost footprint. If you can compost, you use that compost to improve soil tilth. It's not necessarily a fertilizer, but it has a lot of other uses in gardens and on lawns. But ideally, the idea is that we're keeping it right where it's created, or right where it's used. Even though food gets shipped to you, you can stop that process of moving that carbon around by recycling it or composting it right where you live. Okay, somebody's having a little sound problem. Okay. All right. So we're going to look at the composting basics first. What is composting? How to do it, just a basic how to, and then we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into the biology and some of the variables, you know, where things can go wrong. Here's the most technical part, okay? Composting is the aerobic or oxygen requiring decomposition of organic matter by macro and microorganisms under a controlled condition. There's the definition, all right? But another way to think of it is simply manage decomposition. We're helping things decompose. We're managing how they decompose. And as I mentioned before, primarily we're talking about small scale home composting. So you could be composting things like garden and yard trimmings, leaves, all your kitchen scraps, even some cardboards or paper boards that you may have packaging. Okay, wood shavings, really, again, anything you can rot. And we'll look at those in the small or home scale composting. So I mentioned here also a question that people often have: can we compost animal manure? Well, if it's a herbivore manure, and we'll talk, you know, basically saying things like cow, chicken, horse, rabbits, that kind of manure can be composted. Ideally, though, we want a compost that is really cooking, really hot before you put any kind of bedding or manure in there, because sometimes that manure can come along with seeds that become weeds in your landscape later. Certainly kitchen scraps, leaves, and brush, but really it's any organic residual. And I wanted to take some time as we go through this to talk about leaves and composting leaves a little bit. So when we say organic materials, there's two basic types to think about. One is browns, which sometimes people call carbon sources, and that's usually dry or leafy material. So think of leaves, wood chips, or wood shavings. And then greens, nitrogen based, and usually wet materials. So kitchen scraps or scraps from your garden or wet coffee grinds. Those are nitrogen sources. And to manage this decomposition, we want to add these two items in proportional amounts. So carbons to nitrogens, and we'll talk about the proportion, but just kind of break down the things that you have and you're adding to your compost. And one of the most common mistakes that happens is people add a lot of nitrogen, the wet material, and not enough of carbon, the brown materials. So let's take a look at that. Also important to note is that composting reduces the volume and mass of the raw material. So you really need a lot of material to make a little compost. And that's kind of part of the most disappointing part of the process, is that you may fill a compost bin for an entire year and get just a couple of buckets of compost out of it. But keep telling yourself that you're doing a good thing for the world, not just for your garden, by composting on site. So I'm going to go over this kind of lazy composters type of composting. And this is a layered bin where you layer greens and browns. So remembering that the browns are good carbon source, and they're often going to be dry or leafy dry debris. And if you look on the left, hopefully on your screen, these are large enough to read, but things like wood chips and cardboard, that ratio that's next to them, 400 to 1, it's 400 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. Okay, so a lot of carbon. Then slide down to the bottom where you see things like alfalfa, manure, seaweed. Those things have a higher nitrogen to carbon ratio. So that's why we call them green. They just have more nitrogen in them to carbon. Okay, so I also would include in there things like twigs and branches on the bottom, but we'll talk about layering. The real skill in composting is kind of like cooking, how much do I add of this? How much do I add of that? And the general long and short of it is that you do have to get it in a pretty close ratio of 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. 4 parts of carbon to 1 part nitrogen, roughly, okay. There's a little bit of artistry to this, because if it's super wet, it's gonna be, you're gonna have to add a little more dry. If it's super dry, you might have to add a little more wet. But just go over this process. The question, well, actually somebody asked is, will this presentation be available for reference? Most of it's on the Cornell compost waste management site, actually. But I think we mentioned earlier that this will be recorded or is being recorded, so you can refer to it again afterwards as well. But I'd be happy to make the PDF available also if people would like to look at it. So this is kind of the lazy composters version of composting. We'll go through it by process. Is that you start on the pile, at the bottom of the pile, with a layer of sticks and stones. Not to break your bones, but instead to allow air to infiltrate under the pile. All right. Then you start alternating layers of greens and browns. Anytime you add some kitchen scraps, you want to cover them with about 8 inches of browns. And then add finished compost or soil to speed the process. And adding that finished compost or the soil basically is adding microorganisms to the pile. It'll help inoculate the pile to get it composting faster. And again, I said later we'll get into what's inside the compost pile that actually makes it cook. So that's the lazy composting recipe. Just layer, 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 and don't even bother turning. Okay, so turning is often one of the things that people don't like doing. I just wanted to take a moment here to talk about leaf management, because if you go, let me go back a slide, but do you see how you could be adding leaves to this? There's green leaves, there's weeds in here, there's leaves from fallen trees, there's even straw. They're using anything they can get. But at this time of the year, people often ask, like, what about leaves? How do I use leaves? What should I be doing with these leaves? And I'd love to see if people could chat type in the chat window. Do any of you manage leaves on your lawn? And if so, what are you doing with those leaves? How are you reducing them, or how are you moving them? I'd love to know. So yeah, rake them up and dump them in the woods. Yeah, that's what a lot of folks do. Getting blown to the woods. Yeah, a lot of folks blow them to the woods. I'm about to scare you with that one because that's what I used to do. Leave them in the bed as a mulch. Yep. Rake them up and dump them in the compost. Yep. Go into a large area. Great. And use a mulch mower. Yep. Great. I see that. That's my favorite method. Use a mulch mower and use them in the compost pile. It's a great way to do it. I did just hear a paper recently regarding tick management. And I know deer ticks are a big concern for us. What many of us do is blow leaves to the edge of the property. The recommendation is now don't just blow them to the edge, distribute them into the woodlands or mow them directly into your lawn. So a lot of good research about mowing them directly into your lawn, because what this research paper was showing was that if you just blow them to the edge of your property, you increase your deer tick population significantly. So get them into the woods a little bit more, spread them out, or mow them directly into the lawn. A lot of good research showing that as long as the leaves haven't fallen too heavily in one spot, mowing them right into the lawn without bagging them does improve turf quality and soil quality over time. And it is not harmful. I know it's like a cultural response to rake them off the lawn and keep that lawn looking pristine, but I'm giving you permission, just mow them right in. The other option, as many people are doing, is using their mulch mower to chip them into small pieces. And if you look at the photo on the left, that's my compost feed stock, which is basically the whole fall's chopped up leaf debris that I've caught off of the lawn while I'm mowing it. So mowing, I'm going to probably still mow into November because the temperatures have been so warm. I'm just going to keep chopping those up and collecting the leaves. Somebody did mention that there are some leaf blowers that have another attachment to them where it's got a little kind of like a vacuum on it where you can suck the leaves in. They get chewed up into small pieces. And then you can empty that bag out into a feedstock bin like the one on the left. You can also use, and I'm always hesitant to give this recommendation, but I have seen others use this method where you fill a garbage can or a large bin with your leaves and you use a weed whacker like a stick blender and just sort of stick blend those leaves into small pieces, and you will be amazed at how little space these leaves take up once you've chopped them into small pieces. So that works really well. But please wear a mask and please wear protective goggles because it is a dusty, dusty process. So anything that's going to chop those leaves up is going to do two things. It's going to reduce their size and it's going to increase the speed of composting. And we'll talk about later who's doing the composting and why they need it in little pieces. So great. Did I catch everybody there? Yeah, somebody asked about blowing away the topsoil. Yes, blowing, and the high velocity blowers that we have now do remove organic matter from the surface of the soil. And I think they're actually blowing soil away. It's almost too much velocity close to the surface of the soil. There is some concern about that. And certainly it's removing cover for predatory species that do prey on other creatures in the lawn. We do have people say lawn is a biodiversity wasteland, but in fact, there are a lot of animals that live in the lawn. So yeah, the weed whacker is an immersion blender. It's an interesting idea, and I have seen people do it, but wow, is it dusty. But so is any other thing that's going to chop up those leaves. So okay, so back to this idea of having carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that's where most of the time people fail with composting. They put way too much of the green or wet material and not enough of the brown. And if you look at that list on the left, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, there's so many other things you could be composting as well. We did our best to think of all of them that we commonly add. But those wet things will usually clog up the bin. And for those of you who have the tumbling bins, you might have noticed that they get kind of clumpy and wet if you're not adding enough brown. So how do you get enough of that brown stuff if you don't happen to have a wood shop with wood shavings? If you don't happen to have a bale of hay? Well, one of the best bets is leaf debris here in the Northeast. We're lucky to have a lot of leaf debris like that, but you can also use things like shredded straw, and you can use shredded paper. The issue with shredded paper is that it may have been bleached and it may include inks, and some of the, even though inks are now soy-based, some of the things that give ink their color can include heavy metals. So if you're concerned about adding heavy metals to, say, a vegetable garden, then you may want to keep one compost bin for things that are going to not have any of those contaminants in it, and then another compost bin for just doing your bulk composting, for making soil that perhaps you would be putting around things like your shrubs. Okay, so in general, though, look for a 4-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio. And if your pile starts to get really stinky, lumpy, and wet, just throw more carbon-based material in there, more dry material. And that's where kind of the artistry in composting comes in, that balancing act. You know, if it was a soup and you were tasting it, you'd know if you needed to add more of this or more of that. Unfortunately, and hopefully you're not going to be tasting your compost, but just keep that in mind, that ratio in mind. So what not to compost, and this is still under our basic composting topic, because this is an important thing to understand when you're looking at materials that are compostable, but maybe not safely compostable in our small scale compost bins. So certainly the first set, the seedy weeds, invasive plants, or diseased plants like potatoes or tomatoes, which can carry some diseases along with them, and no manure from our pets. Because our home compost bins will probably not get hot enough to destroy the seeds or kill those pathogens. Unless you are aggressively turning your compost pile or aerating your compost pile, most of the time the composting that we do at home is on the cool side, and it's the heat that destroys the seeds. You should also not compost anything like fats, dairy products, meats, fish, and we'll get to the wood ash in a second. But if you think about these things like dairy products, grease, fat, meats, you know, maybe bones to some extent, they may be attractive to varmints. Certainly, I know that the rats like them, and I will say really in general, raccoons will go for anything you put in the compost pile just because I think they like to dig through it. But there was a question earlier about bread. So really bread is at this kind of, it's at the dividing line. If the bread has a lot of fat in it, like say, maybe you've made a banana bread and it's got macadamia nuts and butter and lots of yummy things in it, but it's gone moldy. That does have a lot of fat in it, and it may be attractive to pests. It also will break down more slowly because of the fats in it. If it's just a dry slice of bread that, you know, maybe you found an old loaf of bread in the back of the freezer and it's freezer burned, it's going to have very little fat in it. It'll compost quite well. Just break it up and throw it in with your compost. So for breads and cakes, it's really how much fat or grease is in it. It's hard to compost fats unless you have a very hot, high compost bin. So why not wood ash? A little bit of wood ash is fine. It's too alkaline in larger quantities. The same with bones or bone meal. If you have an old bag of bone meal in your shed that you used to use as a fertilizer, use it sparingly in your compost bin. If it's too alkaline, if the compost bin is too alkaline, it may not compost very well. So use them in moderation. I add to my big compost bin that we'll look at in a little bit, I add a shovel every once in a while, but not the whole bin, just a little shovel, you know, a shovel full. Eggshells are absolutely fine. Even though eggshells include, somebody asked in the chat, even though eggshells do have a lot of protein associated with them, it doesn't all come along for the ride. So most of the time, once you dump that egg out of the shell, there's a little bit of protein left in it. It does compost fairly well, but I will suggest that every time you put the eggshells in the compost bin, break them up. Just really crack them up in your hand before you put them in the bin. Don't put them in whole. They won't break down very well. You also have some other oddball things that don't ever seem to break down. I don't know how many of you are mango eaters, but those mango pits will hang around a long time. They're fine in there. Same with avocado pits. One that you may want to avoid, anything like very seedy, papaya pits. Sometimes you'll have papayas sprouting all over your garden. And it's that first, again, it's up at the top. It's usually not high enough to destroy the seeds. But if a mango or a papaya sprouts in our gardens, it's not a big deal. They're not going to live very long. They're going to get killed by the first freeze. Dehydrated banana peels. I don't know if I've ever found dehydrated banana peels as an object. So Jim and Marilyn, I'm not sure. Banana peels of any kind should compost fine. The question is if they're completely dry, and this is something actually we should probably talk about. So thanks for asking that question. When things get completely dried out, like if you had banana peels and they completely dried out, most of the nitrogen would leave them and they would act as a carbon source. The same with lawn clippings. So if you have a wet lawn clippings, they're a high nitrogen source. If you let them dry out on a hot summer day and you collect them when they are completely dry, they're a higher carbon source. So look at materials that way too. So yeah, you could definitely use them as a carbon. Corn husks are a great carbon source. They're very fibrous though. For those of you who have tried to compost corn husks, sometimes they may break down too slowly. So cut them into pieces. With all of these things, the smaller the size, the better. So let me just see if, okay. So before we go on to the next section, why don't we sit here and talk a little bit about, see if there's any more questions. I'm going to scroll back. Or if you have another question, type it in. Yeah, oh, I see back further. Somebody suggests that they remove the leaves only from around the house and they allow to the compost pile and then leave the rest in the woods as kind of a mulch. And that's what I do with the remainder of mine. So coated paper is not for our composting. I would not compost unless you know it's waxed. Wax does not compost well, but it's not harmful in the soil. Oh, Jim and Marilyn, that's a great question. I have a friend who does, they ask, what about putting all the food scraps into a blender and making a slurry or smoothie? And I do know of folks who are really adamant composters, and they go to garage sales and tag sales and look for old blenders on sale. And they have a garden blender, and anything going out into the garden goes into that blender. I'm just saying, that's an extra level for me. I don't know that I would do it, but I do applaud their stick-to-itiveness. So, but you absolutely can do that. And the more you grind it up, the faster it's going to compost. If you're throwing out your you had watermelon, for example, watermelon rind or cantaloupe rind, chop them up as much as you can, as small as you can, and that'll compost faster. Paper that might be coated, let's see. Stacy, that's a great question. And it's a question of your own choice, a philosophy about what you want to be putting back into your soil. I do know you can strictly stick to organic. If you want to put things in your garden and your garden is an organic garden, only put organic materials into that. But if you want to, and when I say organic, I mean like certified organic, because of course what we're talking about is organic recycling here. So things that are organic in nature, made of something that will rot. The two words can be very confusing. So certified organic you might want to stick to things that are only certified organic going into a compost bin. And then you may use another compost bin for other things that you're not certain of, but that you want to compost on site. Brown paper bags are excellent as long as they're not coated. If they're coated with wax, you're fine. That's okay. Just won't compost as quickly. Break it up. And also paperboard. If you're getting egg cartons or you're getting vegetable cartons made of paperboard, those compost very quickly. You'll be amazed at how quickly they compost. They're nice and coarse, those little egg cartons that have bumps in and out, and they actually are good for your compost bin because they provide some air pockets in the compost bin, which help it compost faster. And how can you tell if something is safe? Well, one of the things, and safe is a really broad term, right? One of the ways to tell, is burning. You can see if you light the edges of something and it melts like wax, you can see that it is a wax, or you'll get a smell from an odor of plastic. But nowadays it is really hard because you can look at a paper bag and it's papery on the outside, but there may be a thin layer of plastic on the inside. Even if you've ever thrown out the rinds of vegetables that you've peeled off and you've left one of the little oval SKU labels on it, you'll find it years later floating around in your compost bin because it was plastic. They'll hang around for a long time. Toilet paper or paper towel rolls, absolutely. Ash from burning weeds. Well, hopefully, actually in New York State, they're asking folks not to burn anything really. So try not to burn weeds if you can. If you are burning them, like you're doing an outdoor bonfire or something and something gets burned, you can certainly use the ashes. But as I said before, in moderate quantities. How to shred cardboard. Actually, I would use the cardboard for sheet mulching. And later on, I'm going to show you what sheet mulching or lasagna composting is. I would compost it on the ground directly in contact with the soil. It's one of the best ways to do it. Otherwise, I think it's actually a danger to you to try to cut it up into small pieces using a utility knife or scissors of some kind. So I did want to, I wanted to show you a short video that I made out in the yard yesterday before we jump into the biology of composting. And I'm going to apologize now for my fashion choices because I was out in the yard working all day and I thought, you know what, it's going to rain tomorrow. Maybe I better take a little video of this. And now you'll be able to see how I dress when I'm working outside. All right. Hopefully, folks, you can see that. Is that showing up on your, good. So this is my compost setup. On the left is a feedstock bin. And that feedstock bin is primarily just a wire, just a wire ring with one stake in it to keep it from getting knocked over. In that is probably 25 or 30 bags from my mulching mower. And it's one of those things that no matter how many times I seem to fill it, when I come back the next day, it's already down by about a quarter. So over the course of the entire fall, I use the back lawn just to fill that bin. And that's my brown material or carbon feedstock for my compost bin. On the right is my handy dandy compost bin, or my left in the picture. And then that's my favorite little compost pail from the kitchen. If I go to recommend any particular compost pail, that would be it. And usually what I do is I dump that into one corner and I rotate around the base of the composter, dumping into a different corner each time I come out. And for every one bucket I add, I'll add 2 really big handfuls of this leafy material. And that's all shredded up from multiple passes with the lawnmower. And those encapsulate the wet compost that I just add. I never turn this bin. I'm a lazy composter, and I just make sure that it really covers the compost bin so that it's not too attractive to the raccoons. This one happens to be locking, but I'll pause this for a second. If you see that it has a door on the back and a door on the front, this composter was designed in Germany, and it apparently they don't have raccoons there, because even though it has a little clip-on door, I had to wire those doors shut because the raccoons totally figured out how to get in there. And I thought I put things in front of it. I leaned things against it. And it wasn't until I twisted the wire on there that I kept them out. For years, this was my method right here. And every fall, I would empty that compost bin right out into my garden. This last year, we added the bin to the right with some pallets. And into that bin now goes my finished compost, which is on the right. And the finished compost is going to wait the course of the winter to really just kind of go the next level. But you can see it's actually pretty well composted. That was the entire composter full about a half a month ago, a couple weeks ago. And I'm sure by spring, it's just going to be a little flat pancake of really yummy soil, but not much. Also in the same bin is a growing pile of lawn debris from this year. The lawn debris, yard debris, all the vegetables I cut down from the garden, all of the, twiggy perennials, things like that, that were gonna get killed by the freeze, and then layered that with chopped leaves. So layer upon layer of leaves and greens and leaves and greens. And I'll just let that compost. I started with kind of the twiggy debris that I'm holding there. That twiggy debris was on the bottom, and every once in a while I put a layer of that twiggy debris in the pile to allow more air to get through, because air is really important. And it really composts pretty well. Okay. Do I sift my finished compost? No, I'm against sifting. That's too much work. Now, honestly, you actually want something that is irregular when you're done. You don't want something too regular. The more irregular your compost, it should have large pieces and small pieces, the better your aeration is going to be for your soil. You always want to have kind of an imperfect mix, because large chunks will make for some large air pockets, and smaller chunks will make for smaller air pockets. And good soil has a mixture of air pockets and places that are smaller that will hold water. So you really do want the coarse bits in there. I take out really big things like a twig that didn't compost, because I'm just going to have trouble with that in the garden when I'm working. But no, I really don't. I try to do this part where everything gets moved over once a year. And then I will take from this pile as time goes on next year. If I'm going to do maybe some pots on my porch or need to layer on my vegetable garden, I'll draw from that finished compost pile. The bin will probably take me the whole winter to fill up there's just 2 of us in our household. We do a lot of cooking, so a lot of vegetable scraps. And during the winter, it will not compost. It'll be too cold. But early spring to mid-spring, the compost will come alive again. And in just a few weeks, that almost full compost bin is going to compost right down, and I'll spend the rest of the summer trying to fill it back up again. So I in the past, I've rarely ever gotten to the point where I've filled the compost bin and said, uh-oh, what's going to happen next? But that's the right size for us. If you have a bigger household, you might either need 2 of those or a bigger one. Steve asked, what about worms? The worms that are in that compost bin, I'm kind of worried about where they came from. They're red wigglers, and red wigglers are what you use for vermicomposting. It's a small non-native worm that is not well suited to life in the Northeast, and they usually die in the winter. My experiences lately, and I've grown up here in this area, so I'm familiar with the cycle of life here, is that red wigglers have been surviving in compost piles. But that's really the only place we ever find them is compost piles. So red wigglers will get in there and they'll do a great job moving things around. You'll end up with all kinds of critters in there. We're going to take some time and look about critters that end up in your compost pile. The critters you don't want to have in there, you don't want to have rats move in. And if you're concerned about rats or you've had rats in the neighborhood before, I mean, rats are part of our landscape. We do have a native rat here as well. But the only time I ever ended up with rats in the compost pile was when we were just like throwing everything in it, the kitchen sink, things that they were really gonna like things like cake, sweets, things that were probably heavier in fats than I should have been throwing in. But boy, did they turn the compost pile. They turned it and they turned it again, and they actually got the compost pile to it until it was hot and steaming. But the concern, of course, is just safety. None of us really wants to deal with critters living in our compost bin when we go out there. So best not to put those attractive things in there in the first place. So that's my setup there. Oops, I'm going to go back to the presentation that we had going. There we go. And then we can look at the biology. But before I go to the biology of composting, do people have more questions about kind of the basics, about what to put in, how to do it? I mean, I have more slides later about the different kinds of bins you could get and different ways of composting, but that's the basic of it. Oh, so somebody asked carbon nitrogen ratio by volume or mass. And it's actually by volume, but most of us can't do that kind of on the fly, like, okay, wait a minute, is wood chips 200 to 1 or 400 to 1? And if it's 400 to 1, should I add this many cups or that many cups? It's too hard to do on the fly, but you could be if you're very analytic and you want to do it that way, you could do it that way. But that's for the most part, we just sort of lean against the mass, like I'm sorry, like, you know, how much, okay, if I'm putting in 2 quarts of wet material, I will put in 3 or 4 times that much in leafy browns, and 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 ratio. I just find leaves to work really easily because we have so many of them, but you could use other things as well. So Jerry asks about native earthworms. For the most part, in the Northeast, there are no native earthworms. Almost all of the worms that we see are post-glaciation introductions by people who have moved plant materials here from Europe or Asia. So, sorry, somebody's on mute. There we go. So the earthworms that are native to this part of North America, there's a few pockets of them that escaped the glaciers. Almost everything else was introduced afterwards. If you go down south where the glaciers didn't reach, there are earthworms down there. But our forests here and our landscapes here, the plant communities here are evolved without earthworms in the soil. So we always thought earthworms are great. Now we're finding out that for the Northeast, earthworms are actually devastating our soil ecosystem, or forest ecosystems. Okay, let's dive into the pile. We talked about wet greens being their sources of nitrogen and dry browns as carbon. And nitrogen is a nutrient that drives the process, but usually those things also add moisture to the pile. The carbon gives structure and also acts as an absorptor, you know, so you're putting wet things in there and the carbon can kind of dry it out. So sometimes people even add their paper towels to their compost as another carbon source. So thinking of the carbons and nitrogen, wet greens versus the dry browns of the carbon. How does this process work? So primarily the process is driven by little critters, and those are the larger of the little critters here, but there are kind of different trophic levels. We have the decomposers, the bacteria, the fungi, and the molds are helping to start the decomposing process. But then we have slightly larger organisms that tear things to bits, making it easier for the microbes to get a hold of the materials. So there's a lot of words there, and I don't expect you to read them all and absorb them all, but we have a variety of organisms that help the compost break down. And they're all going to be in there at one time or another. And depending on your level of being creeped out by little things, compost bins are alive. They're alive with movement. And I'm always amazed at different times when I open up my bin. One time there'll be a cloud of little gnats and they've had a good couple of weeks. Another time there'll be a whole bunch of millipedes. Another time I'll open them up and I'll have a whole bunch of rove beetle larvae crawling around in there. I just don't look. If it's something that bothers you, don't look too close because they're in there and they're doing the work for you. They're really doing most of the work. If we look at this, it's an illustration put together by our colleagues at CCE Dutchess. There's a lot going on here, but let's walk through it. The basic biology is that we have the decomposers at the lowest trophic level, the bacteria, the molds, the protozoa, the fungi that are taking the materials and breaking them apart. But above them are the shredders and grazers. These are the things that are kind of ripping apart the materials. And the more they rip the materials apart, the easier it is for those fungi, bacteria to do their job. Also in the pile are invertebrate predators that are feeding on the shredders and grazers. This is all going on in one pile. It's like a whole city in there. Into that pile, we are putting organic materials. And if the pile is getting really dry, or if we have a rainfall, we're putting some water in there. And the addition of organic materials and water is what really sort of instigates the process of the decomposers, the fungi and the bacteria and the molds. Out of that whole little ecosystem in our compost pile gives some water is given off, some heat is given off, some CO2 is given off, and finished compost eventually. That's the smallest arrow, the finished compost. We don't get a lot out of it. The pile does also need air. So most compost bins are going to have a way to either get air into them by having holes in the side or having you twist the compost bin around. Air is really important. And in the pile that I showed you, that was just layers, you have to add some coarse materials like twigs and brush to allow air to get in there. Otherwise, you'll get this kind of sludge of mushy, stinky, wet stuff that makes composting unpleasant for many. That's often where things go wrong for people. Can you put moldy food in? Oh, you bet. Absolutely. So if I grew up on a small farm, and many of the foods that I compost now would have gone to animals to eat, but we never fed them anything moldy. That always went into the compost bin. But almost everything, including things like potato peels and apple peels, everything that was nearly edible for us went to feed an animal. And most of the stuff that went into the compost bin was either moldy things that weren't safe to feed them, or garden debris, leafy debris, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different ways to recycle organic material, right? But this is your little world here. And they're doing all the work, these critters in your compost pile. So I mentioned before that we have like a 3-to-1 mixture of browns to greens, or a 4-to-1 mixture of browns to greens. Those carbons are used mostly by the shredders and decomposers for the food. And the nitrogen is used by the shredders and decomposers for reproduction and growth. So they need a good mix as well to make a healthy compost pile. And that's why we're adding it at that mixture. Okay. So I mentioned air is needed for aerobic decomposition. So one way or another, you've got to get air in there. Turning is one way to aerate, but it's a lot of work. And to do it well, you have to do it every week or two. And if you do it every week or two, you will get really good composting, but only if you have a large pile. So the pile to get hot composting, where you're turning and aerating it and you're getting steam generated, you'll see heat coming off of it. You need a pile that's about 3 by 3 by 3. Most bins aren't quite that big, but if you make a bin for yourself, make sure you make it big enough to do that and turn it and aerate it. If you're into that, If not, you can use my lazy composting method, which is just to layer it. Okay. Another important variable is moisture. And I can't stress this enough, but the two places that people go wrong is either they add way too much wet nitrogen-based material and they get a scary soggy lump, or they add too much dry material and there's not enough moisture to drive the composting. So those organisms do need moisture. So if you liken it to maybe a sponge, you would want to be able to wring the sponge out most of the way and still have a little bit of moisture showing between your fingers, right? So this slide refers to a squeeze test where you put your hand into the compost and you grab it. Yum. And you give it a squeeze. It should feel moist to the touch and a little drop or two of liquid would come out of it. If a lot of liquid comes out of it, or it just literally squeezes out of your hand, you have to incorporate a lot more of the dry matter to it. Okay. And if you want to add, if you've got too dry, you're going to have to add water. So water, just to get it started, often is supplied by rainfall, right? With our compost bins that we protect from critters, they're almost encapsulated. There's no way for rainfall to fall on them. So what I suggest is, like, when you go to take your compost bin outside, add a little bit of water right at the kitchen sink to that compost bin. It'll slurp right out of there easily. And B, you're doing the job of adding more liquid to the pile, especially in the summer. Oh, it says someone's in the waiting room. Okay. Bill and Marcia, I totally hear you. They have a rotating barrel. I had a rotating barrel, and I've had this reported from several people, that as you keep adding to that rotating barrel, it sometimes gets so wet and heavy, it's hard to turn again. And I have never talked to anybody who's had good luck with the rotating barrel. So if you've got a rotating barrel that's wet, throw a ton of leaves in there and try to break up that wet clump and just rotate it. Don't add any more food to that. Treat it as a compost bin that you're finishing. Just add a lot of dry leaf material to it. Let me see does that answer your question? Hopefully that answers your question. Then start another composting bin. These rotating bins get very wet and very heavy and really hard to turn. But they're a great way to finish compost. So if you put compost in there that's already done its first part of composting, throw a bunch of leaves in there and just keep turning it. It's a good way to finish the process, but don't just keep adding fresh stuff to it. And then here's that variable surface area again. The smaller you can chop up the material, the faster it's going to compost. However, larger particles are going to give you better aeration. So always aim for a mix, some coarse, some fine, and it makes a happier home for shredders and decomposers. And it's always so going to give you better aeration and moisture retention when you use it in the garden. So what happens in that pile to get it hot? There's a couple of stages of decomposition, and actually part of it just goes over and over and over again. And let's go through it. It's good to know, but you don't have to, it's not going to be on the test, okay? So the first stage is a mesophilic stage. And at this point, you're adding material to it, and the microorganisms are starting to reproduce and use the nutrients in the pile. As they do this, the temperature raises, it increases to the point where it starts to kill them off, and their populations reduce. But as the temperature reduces along with that, they start to increase their population again. and they start again to reproduce and decompose the material, using up the nutrients, causing the temperature of the pile to increase again. And this goes on for a while, up and down, up and down. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, when I open the compost bin up, there's always seems to be a new population of critters in there. In some cases, some do better than others on one of these roller coasters here. So as this process goes on and on, it's an iterative process. Each time they use up a little bit more of that nitrogen, and they continue to use up the nitrogen and continue to use up the nitrogen until there's not enough left to pop it into the next phase. So one more circle here, and that's called the curing phase. And the curing phase is, we sometimes call it the finishing phase, where even if you turn the compost and you try to get more air into it, the temperature won't come up anymore. And that's actually the part where compost is safe to use, when you can no longer kind of incite a population growth by adding air or turning the mix. And that's, if you use it before then, you may have composting that occurs in the garden. And when composting occurs around the root system of a plant, it sometimes can hurt or harm the plant because of the high temperatures. So turning the compost will get this whole process started. Adding oxygen to it will get it started, but it does create quite a bit of heat. And that heat is detrimental to the root system of plants. So this is where I want you to think about the carbon and nitrogen ratio again. Each time we have one of these roller coasters here, we have a rise in temperature as nitrogen is consumed. The nitrogen level in that compost is reduced, making the ratio of carbon to nitrogen wider, right? So eventually, most of that nitrogen is used up, and it's mostly a carbon that's left as a final or finished compost. And it's for that reason that we really can't use compost as a plant food. It's really never a fertilizer, it's a soil builder. And the reason is there's just really no nitrogen left in it. There's very little nitrogen. There's a lot of carbon and a lot of fiber and air spaces, but not a lot of nitrogen. So think of it as a great addition to your soil, but not as a fertilizer. So just to review, we get to put all this stuff in there, and actually, how much time do we have? Do we have another half an hour? Okay. There's a little bit more in here. I might skip ahead to some of the compost bins, but as we're looking at this, I just want to see if there's any questions about the basics before we go into the kinds of compost bins that you could use and some of the alternate methods of composting on your property. I wish, do we have everybody's email address? We can't send this this to them, but I can send you the link to the compost.
Yeah, if I put a link in earlier, I'll put it in again to subscribe to Sustainable Putnam so that they are on our email list.
Great. And that's a great way to get it. Okay, so that's sort of the kind of the whole thing in a nutshell. But now you can look at it and it's like, oh, I know what that stuff is. I know what that means. How do I feel about compost additives? Yeah, the compost additives are often things, I'm hoping this is what you mean, like a compost starter. And that starter is usually kind of microorganisms. You can use a compost starter when you're first starting composting, or you can go out to the edge of the woods and just grab a scoop of some of our native soil. It'll be chock full of microorganisms to get the process started. So, okay. I think we should dive into the idea of the different types of composting that we can do. Okay, here's my slide. I thought I lost this one, but yes, it's not a fertilizer. It's a great soil amendment. You can use it as mulch. You can add it to your potting soil, and certainly as a top dressing for lawns and gardens. It builds great soil, but it's not a fertilizer. So let's do a little bit of troubleshooting. Actually, we kind of did that as we go. Well, we did that as we went. So yeah, I have a great little, this is a kind of all-in-one, which you could look at later, what's going on. But I'd love to spend some time looking at other alternative compost methods. So you will find this on the Compost Waste Management Institute. You'll also find it by a link through the Sustainable Putnam group. I wanted to look at these other types of compost systems because I think they're really helpful. If you are trying a couple of different methods, or for example, you want to get rid of woody debris, you've gotten a fallen tree, you can absolutely compost whole trees. And I'll talk about how we do that. So it's really all about how quickly do you want it to compost? How much work do you want to do or money you want to spend? When I was a kid, we composted directly in the ground. It's called direct incorporation. We never had a bin. We just had a hole. And that's how we composted. So of course, and then what level of scale and do you have? Where is it going to be? And what level of commitment do you have? Or level of fuss do you want to engage in? And there's really something for everybody in looking at the different compost systems that are out there. Large scale or hot composting requires space and it requires regular turning. These are all images from the Waste Management Institute up at Cornell on the composting that they do with the waste from the university. And this is all primarily food scraps mixed with either stable bedding from the or cow manure wastes that are used to provide the carbon. Because as you can imagine, the food coming out of the compost bins at the cafeteria is organic matter, and it does include all kinds of organic matter, including meat and fats. But this is hot and large-scale composting. So the regular turning of the compost causes that cycling, the mesophilic thermophilic cycling to get up very hot and very high, and it gets up hot and high again and again and again till all the nitrogen is used. This is not something we do in our backyards, okay? You can even compost mortality, farm mortality. Any cows or horses that die on the farm are now usually composted. And the way they do that is by creating a very large pocket of carbon around the dead animal. And this is a skeleton of a whale that was brought from the coast that had died on the beaching. And it was covered with compost because a local museum needed another whale skeleton. And this was a humane way of using that, of getting that whale skeleton. Ended up at the New Bedford Whaling Museum for any of you who ever go there. But this kind of composting allowed them to find all of the bones and also to all that material, all that nitrogen and fat that was part of that animal. It was incorporated into a pile there that you see that was remarkably smaller than its original mass. So amazingly effective. And that's how a lot of deer roadkill and farm mortality is composted these days. There's also medium scale, like a farm size, and small scale composting where you have air injected into the system, either by pipes that run through the pile, blowers, all kinds of amazing and inventive methods of composting. One of the more effective, we talked about those rotating drums. If you see on the bottom right-hand side, there's a school that uses the larger rotating drums, and you always have to have two going at the same time. One that's receiving new compost and one that's finishing up that cycle of cycling mesophilic and thermophilic. But for us on the small scale in our backyards, there's a number of methods. I love the photo on the left. If any of you have ever seen this happen from a tumbling bin, please let me know. I really think for the picture, they put some topsoil in there and just kind of scraped it out to make it look like that. It's great for finishing, but not for doing your first composting. The bin on the right is for a great method of composting yard wastes. And the way that you compost it is by moving it from bin to bin to bin. And again, minimum size for a cold composting system should be about a cubic yard, 3 by 3 by 3. Most bins that you buy, the plastic bins, are not quite that large, but they're close enough. They work pretty well for us. But try building one of these in your backyard for your waste, and it's amazing what you can compost in it. Or you could just do on the ground, direct incorporation. You just make a pile and turn it. It doesn't cost anything. And as long as you're not putting kitchen scraps in it, the critters will leave it alone. I have talked to folks who do this. They do it with their kitchen scraps, but every time they put kitchen scraps in, they cover it with a lot of brown material like wood chips and leaves about 8 inches or more on top of the kitchen scraps. And they say that the raccoons are not getting into it. So it's you make a pile, you minimum of 3 by 3 by 3. Again, try to keep it that cubic yard. And you'll need a lot of browns to add to it as well. Or this, in the ground, direct incorporation. You dig a hole, you put the stuff in it, and then you throw the dirt back on top of it. A couple of weeks later, you dig a different hole. You just keep moving those holes around your property. A lot of people used to do that. And if you think of the idea of of creating a hole next to a plant, putting debris into it, covering that debris back up. But at least 6 to 8 inches of soil and tamp it down. Otherwise, creatures will find it. Not that that's a bad thing, but it can be a very messy thing. And nobody likes to run across raccoons in their backyard in the night when it's a big surprise, right? So, small bin composting, that's a good question. Janet, if you do small bin composting in a apartment, or if you're using worms or other methods, you'll never get hot composting in there, but eventually things will decompose. The question is that, will you get enough microorganisms in there to do the job? You have to use an additive, or get soil or compost from somebody else. And frequently you won't get those big shredders, the macrobes, you get plenty of microbes, but not a lot of macrobes to do the shredding. So there are other ways you can do small scale composting indoors, and we'll talk about those at the end. This 3-bin turning unit, it can be very expensive. It can be very long lasting. We had ours for 15 years, but after 15 years, it started to fall apart at our demonstration at our office. But basically, you're tag teaming, you're moving it from bin to bin to bin. Your method of turning it is, when it's time to turn it, you toss the whole thing into the neighbor bin, and then you keep rotating them. But it's a lot of turning work. I'm not interested. This is probably the most typical type of tower bin, where you purchase a plastic bin, you fill it up. Sometimes it has a bin door on the bottom to help you get stuff out. But experience with these has shown that's usually a good idea to have 2. One for adding new compost to, one for finishing compost. And the idea is that you open the bin up from the bottom and scrape out this beautiful brown soil. No, it just doesn't really work that way. It's usually good to open the bin from the bottom, scrape all that stuff out, and then turn it into a bin to finish the last cycle of composting. All right, whoops, I went backwards there. And then we've talked a lot about these already, right? So it gets too wet, heavy, and too wet to turn. That's the issue that most people have, it, especially the one on the left. You can imagine when all the compost falls to the bottom, how do you lift that up with 40 or 50 pounds of wet compost so that you can rotate it? The one on the right is a little bit easier to turn. When they're more of a barrel, that with the axis running parallel to the ground. So it's not the best way to go. If you've got one, just keep throwing those carbon sources in there, the brown sources in there. Somebody asked, what is that time? I'm sorry, Jim and Marilyn, I went past I went past that too fast. Can you remind me which of the time is? You asked, what is that time?
I think they meant the time to move in the three
And the three bin.
compartment system.
It's, if you could literally, if you could move it every week or turn it every week, it would compost faster. So the time is really based on your tolerance for turning. And people who do that kind of composting, and you can, if you really want to get serious about this, you can get a compost thermometer. It's a special long, thin thermometer. When the compost is hot, you let it cool down, and then you turn it again, and then it'll start heating up again. So you actually take the compost bin's temperature in order to determine when you've gone from the mesophilic to the thermophilic and back to the mesophilic level again. And as soon as you get back to the cool temperature, then you turn it. You could do it every week, but the temperature gauge will help you determine when to turn it. But that seems like an advanced topic, but that's really what it is. You know, it is really literally taking the temperature of the bin and then turning it when it's ready. Okay. And then I did want to talk about hugelkultur, because living here in the Northeast with the kind of storms that we have, it's really good to think about how we can compost branches and tree trunks on our own property. And I'm going to show you this method. It's a German word that basically means hill culture or mound culture, because when you're done, you end up creating a mound over the debris. So don't be intimidated by this, because the first thing my husband and I did when we moved here to this house is like, I want to make a hugelkultur bed. And he had one of those looks, wait, did I sign up for this? And they're like, yes, you did. So this is what it is. Ideally, what you do is you mix all different thicknesses and levels of decay, branches, tree trunks, and any other woody debris that you can. You first dig a trench, you load it with these logs, and then you take all the soil you dug out of the trench and cap the whole mound. You can plant directly into that mound, and over the course of 3 or 4 years, all of the microbes that we talked about do all the work, and the mound goes from something that's 4 or 5 feet high to something that's about 6 to 8 inches high. It's very effective. As you can imagine, the air pockets in there make for happy roots and really happy decomposers. I think I have one other picture, but that's sort of a cross section. Branches and woody debris covered with soil, dig all that soil back on top that you dug out, and then you can either cap it with topsoil or just cover it with mulch and plant directly into it. I love it. And the other thing we talked about getting rid of newspapers and cardboard is sheet composting or lasagna composting. This is a great way to make a new bed. And this is a great time of the year to do it with all those fallen leaves. Start with newspaper, 6 to 10 sheets thick, or cardboard. Just put it, weed whack the weeds down, weed whack the grass down. Don't remove the soil, don't remove anything. Just leave it all there. Put the cardboard on top of it. 6 to 10 sheets thick if you're using newspaper, and then bring on anything you have on top. It could be shredded leaves. It could be lawn clippings, as much as you can get. And the same ratio recipe, 3 to 4 parts of carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And you keep building these layers up to about 24 inches high. You will have to beg, borrow, and steal all of your neighbors' leaves as well to get this high, I'm sure, because that's a lot of organic matter. But within the season of winter into next spring, this will all decompose from about 24 inches down to about 6 to 8 inches of the most delicious soil. And you're just going to plant right into it in the spring. If you're putting in a big pot, you dig a hole through the cardboard and cut the cardboard, but it does an amazing job of creating soil and suppressing weeds. And you get rid of so much stuff on your own property. It's going to go all into there. So Bill and Marcia asked, can you Mod in a carton. I need a better, what does mod mean? Okay, I don't, but there you go. Could you do it in a carton? You probably could, like a cardboard box, to do the lasagna, or composting. Is that what you mean? If you did cardboard boxes, you still need to get a mass. You need more mass, to get the thermophilic and mesophilic, cycling. But okay. Oh, don't compost pressure treated wood. Even though pressure treated wood does not use the same heavy metals that it used to use, there is not really good research showing us what happens to the current wood preservatives in soil. So if you're going to compost it in an area where you're not growing food again, okay, it would have to just don't, if you're cutting it, you always should be wearing mask when you're cutting pressure treated wood, no matter what. But here, yes, you could. You could compost any kind of wood. It's amazing what has happened to my pile in no time at all. Originally, I put blueberries in my pile and they loved having all that woody debris and air circulation to really grow. Great root system. So in this case, as an example, we had an area in the garden. We dumped everything. We emptied out all of our old compost bins. We threw in peat moss bales, shredded office paper, as you can see, kind of a mess because it blew around. But then we capped the whole thing with hay bale, shredded hay bale, and left it for the winter. And the next spring, we built a little bit of a box around it, and that's what we ended up with. If you can kind of see, it was remarkably delicious soil and happy plants. So, okay. So you can also make your own. Take those leafy paper bags, pile them up on the edge of the woods. They will eventually compost in their bags. You can do garbage pail composting, wire bins, and then I lastly I'm just going to skip this briefly, and I wanted to go to these indoor options because that was a question. You can do bokashi, which is a fermented organic matter soup. It's an indoor composting soup where you use a microorganism to do your composting for you. Or you can use a vermicomposting or red wiggler system. It doesn't have to be as fancy as the one on the right. You can do vermicomposting just in a tub with air holes drilled in it, very fine air holes, because the worms do escape through air holes. But composting with worms indoors can be very fast and effective. And it's nice to have the company of these cute little worm pets. But it is, suddenly you do have a new pet when you're vermicomposting. You have somebody new to take care of. So I'm just going to mention those two. I'm going to go back to the previous slide so you can see the pros and cons. But bokashi or vermicomposting are great for indoor composting on a small scale and a very quick scale. So a little bit, we'll leave that up to mull over, but I'll see if folks have questions as we sort of wrap things up. Oh, I see, Bill and Marcia, exactly what you were asking. Can you do it in a carton? I think you could, and I'm actually really intrigued by that idea. If you took a big cardboard box and you started layering these things in now, two things would have to happen. You'd have to inoculate it with some microorganisms, and you'd have to put it outside so that you have moisture or ample moisture or watering. Because remember, to get the composting process started, you do need water to get those microorganisms growing. Yeah, yes, wood chips was somewhere around 400 to 1. And that, of course, being a living material originally, can have variability depending on if the tree was dead when they chipped it versus if it was alive when they chipped it. So fresh green chips from a living tree that was taken down, say by an arborist, those can have a little bit more nitrogen in it than those from a dead tree. But yeah, 400 to 1. Yeah, that's a lot of carbon, but you kind of can imagine that, right? If you were chipping up the leaves with the wood, there would be even more nitrogen. And sometimes in the summer, that's what you're getting. Leaves with a little bit of leaves with a lot of chips. And that's actually almost a nice mix to compost all on its own. All right. And I don't think I put a last slide in there with my name and, I didn't go into the vermicomposting, but I think that my address is somewhere in here. Oh, I did want to say that we do have a compost demonstration site that right now we're actually reinvigorating during COVID, just to kind of take our old bin that was 15 years old. So if you're, and make it all new and beautiful. So if you're around that area, we're starting to put up the new signs and you can see the turning bin. We're trying to compost with our health department. So there's a lot of folks working there with compost material. So we're trying to get them to join in with us. So the nutrient composition of finished compost should be almost no nitrogen, but it's going to have a lot of carbon and other minerals that came along for the ride. There shouldn't be very much compost. There might be micronutrients. I'm sorry, there shouldn't be very much nitrogen. There might be lots of micronutrients. And if you buy purchased compost from a local composter that ascribes to, there's a Cornell test where they can send their compost up there and it will actually give them the nutrient composition of compost. But it's kind of what goes in and what comes out. You could, by the time you get the results from that test, your compost could be different. You know, if the compost is still composting, the only real way to know is to send that test out, see what you get back. It's also recommended if you're going to buy compost from a commercial composter to ask them to see the analysis of their compost to see what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is, which should be down around 20 to 1. It shouldn't, you know, or 30 to 1 when all is said and done, or even 40 to 1. But any higher than that, it could end up composting on you. They also should be able to tell you the heavy metal contents of any commercial composting, because you don't want to bring a problem into your landscape, especially to your vegetable garden. That's one of the reasons it's good to do it yourself, because you know what you're putting in.
All right.
Yeah.
Jen, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen. This was a really thoughtful and thorough and really interesting recording. I feel a little taller as a result, so thank you for that. And Joe, where can people find this workshop that we've recorded?
Well, we're going to upload it to YouTube, and we'll share the link in our next newsletter.
Great.
So if people are not on our mailing list and they are interested in getting that and perhaps other links and information from Jen, if you want to share any other links such as Cornell Cooperative Extension's website and so forth. Nope, there we go. We can email that to people as well.
Right, because I think, Jen, you were saying a lot of the slides that were on here are actually on the composting site on the Cornell Cooperative website, right?
Yeah, the Waste Management Institute has a lot of great fact sheets, and we borrowed a lot of their photos.
Cool.
Yeah.
So we wish everyone success in creating your own composting masterpieces, and maybe reduce some of that methane in the landfills and generate even healthier soil. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen.
Oh, you're welcome. So glad.
Great to see everyone.
Absolutely.